fourth estate, Charles Mwangu Shampagi, on this actually very historic day in very many respects. It's the 1st of May, so officially it's Labor Day, and earlier today we were watching the national celebrations happening in Masindi, which are still going on. I mean, we're still going on by the time, by early this afternoon, and people continuing the celebration. But what does Labor Day mean? 2 days from now, we will be marking International Press Freedom Day. And if you tie journalists as workers into International Labor Day and look at International Press Freedom Day and look at the situation of the press in this country, especially over the last 1 year, lots of questions to ask. It's actually the year when we saw government stepping in to help pay medical bills for a journalist who was beaten on duty by the police simply for doing his job. And he is hospitalized, he can't get any help, he doesn't earn enough money, or the station that he works for, or the institution he works for can't take care of all his medical bills, and you have to go into a fundraiser, and that fundraiser is bailed out by the president, not the government of Uganda. Very interesting developments. And of course, questions about media censorship, questions about whether the media, as the fourth estate, we're being professional enough, we're being ethical enough, all questions that tie into the harassment of the media. This is also a day when we remember the death of Noble Mayombo. At the time he died on 1st May 2007. He was Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Defense, but earlier we know him more for his intellectualism and for being the director of the Chieftains of Military Intelligence. I have also just learned, actually, from the guest I'm about to introduce, that this is also the 35th anniversary of a coup in this country that many people don't know about, when the UNLF government was overthrown and replaced by the military commission. So let me introduce a very high-power panel tonight. Let me start with Dr. Peter Mwesige. Very nice to have you.
Thank you, Charles. Good evening, viewers.
Dr. Peter Mwesige is Executive Director of the African Center for Media Excellence. He's been a journalist, actually reported in Parliament, and there's an interesting debate around Parliament, and it's the press corps that covers Parliament. Maybe you'll comment about that. And he's taught journalism. He's also been an editor at the highest level, including your last assignment at the National Media Group in Nairobi. And you've also taught journalism at Makerere University. I'll take a jump from Professor and go to Onapito Ekomoloit. Onapito Ekomoloit has been following closely in the footsteps of Peter.
It's
they
vice
work
versa.
Together.
It's vice versa.
Yes, vice versa. Onapito, you know him as a panelist, a regular panelist on this show, and he's reported journalism, he's taught journalism. He's together with Peter, they attempted to found a newspaper.
Just
attempted. We founded a newspaper.
They founded a newspaper and it folded and ran it for some time. It ran a very powerful story before it folded because you projected on what would be in the budget. I think that was your last issue of the Crusader. And now to have both of them, but Onapito now works at Nile Breweries, SAB Miller, as Corporate Affairs Director. Always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Good evening, viewers.
And let me introduce a man. I asked someone yesterday, I bumped in a salon in Wandege. He said, do you know Professor Yash Tandon? And he said, who is Professor Yash Tandon? I said, do you know about the Gang of Four? He said, yes, I have heard about the Gang of Four. Professor Yash Tandon has had a very colorful and interesting political, activist, academic history with Uganda. The Gang of Four refers to a very powerful team of 4 professors who actually shaped political discussions many years ago in this country. The others, I know Professor Edward Rugumayo. If you're watching this show, you must be excited to be meeting your colleague, Professor Yash Tandon. Professor Rugumayo is retired. He lives in Port Poto now. Professor Yash Tandon is retired. He lives in the United Kingdom. And together, the other 2 colleagues of yours have unfortunately since passed on. The Professor Dan Wadada Nabudere and the late Professor Omonyo Jok. Very nice to have you. It's a pleasure to have you on the show tonight.
Thank you very much.
Let's start the discussion on World Press Freedom Day. A day which came into effect because of a resolution of the General Assembly of the UNESCO. You have been, since you retired from active journalism and media management, you've been trying to create a media environment where the media actually takes first responsibility in terms of its training, in terms of execution, in terms of what do you take? I mean, what does this 3rd May, Tuesday, for the Ugandan journalist, for the Ugandan consumer of media products, what does it mean?
I think all over the world, May 3rd is a day that is used to remember those who have lost their lives in exercise of journalism, to remember press freedom itself and its condition all over the world, and to promote press freedom as a key fundamental freedom. Yep.
Do you see, in the context of Uganda, we've just gone through an election, which has been rather difficult. The journalist we're talking about, who worked for WBS TV, was beaten, and I think he's literally disabled in a way until that operation happens and he's able to be restored to normal life. It was because he was covering a demonstration that somehow was related to the politics and governance of this country, but a guy on the front line doing his job. You have another journalist working with NBS TV who was beaten up and detained in a police van because of doing their job. And many journalists have appeared to become a target of police together with other, not demonstrators. I am keen to make the distinction between demonstrators and rioters.
That's right.
Because you deal with the two groups differently. But you can no longer stand proudly as a Ugandan journalist with your press badge or even press jacket and feel like that gives you protection against both the demonstrators or protesters and the police.
Yeah.
I don't know if you do tracking of this harassment of journalists in this country.
No, we do. One of our collaborators or partners, called the Human Rights Network for Journalists, and they have done reports in the last few months that show that attacks on journalists, assaults on journalists increased quite, profoundly between October last year and up to the elections. I think up to 17 journalists were assaulted, mainly by police, actually, and security forces. There have been very many cases of intimidation of journalists also, including grabbing of their cameras or equipment, recorders and all that. Threats, from goons, like, stick-wielding goons, during demonstrations. Some of them received threats over the phone, SMS and all that. So this is actually a day, World Press Freedom Day is a day when we remember those kinds of attacks on the independence of the media, those kinds of violations on the lives of the media sometimes, including death of journalists, occasioned by both state and non-state actors.
Every time you invoke the word freedom, you also have to marry it with the word responsibility. Has, in your view, the media acted responsibly enough, professional enough, not to attract the wrath of the police? Some people argue and say, we as the fourth estate, as the media, as the press, we're attracting some of this on ourselves.
Charles, I think that's a very good question, and I want to say this from the very beginning. Onapito and others will tell you, of course, I have stood for excellence in journalism, for professionalism, for responsibility. But I think it would be a very big mistake once we begin equating responsible journalism and, and freedom, because I don't think that irresponsible journalism should be punished by imprisonment or criminalization. I think that whereas we should all promote a journalism that informs and engages, we should also understand that when mistakes are done, sometimes or very often, they are innocent mistakes. They are not mistakes of enemies of the state that you should therefore imprison them or kill them or assault them, That's, I think, where we go wrong in this country, to equate mistakes done by fairly young journalists, who are maybe ill-equipped and, who are ill-funded with, treason and things of that sort, Yeah.
Let me turn it to Honor, because you've also taught journalists, you've edited their work, you've also written, you've been a writer. World Press Freedom Day in the context of Uganda, when the media is actually so much in the spotlight, especially the debate going on whether the journalists without degrees can cover Parliament of Uganda.
Look, I think just taking on from Peter, to me, on the face of it, it would appear like the biggest enemy of journalism in this country, or journalists, is government, and then some may add advertisers.
Corporate interests.
But I think seriously, the biggest enemy of journalism in this country, and really when we talk of journalists, we are talking about the print or newspaper journalists. Radio, TV, we all know it's really about all kinds of people are now dominating those mediums. So to me, the real enemy of the journalists is society, because they have taken away the power of the journalists to determine their own fate. When Peter and I were running the Crusader, which I believe was the last experiment in truly running a journalism-based newspaper, whereby you survive on copy sales, the excellence of journalism is what determines your fate. But when society general does not buy newspapers, it now takes the power and puts the power in the hands of the advertisers. It allows government to hold its sway. Even when you write stories about corruption and government excesses and people don't buy them, then as a journalist, your ability to be independent, to live without requiring government protection, without requiring maybe the goodwill of advertisers, your hands get tied. So I think really for journalists to have true freedom, they need to be able to get people to appreciate their labor. This is Labor Day. The people need to consume their products. They need to buy newspapers reasonably well. I mean, people like to argue that, yes, maybe they don't have enough disposable income, but I now work with a fast-moving consumer good, that's beer and many others, airtime. The consumption of all these products has increased substantially over the years. But newspaper circulation has even gone lower and lower.
That's true.
Of course, you may also blame technology advances in terms of social media, the internet, which makes it easier to access news faster than a newspaper. But still, there is a place for a newspaper. There's a place for a newspaper. And I think society needs to help journalists to get more independent by buying newspapers, such that journalists can, for example, run a newspaper without relying on advertising. Now, marketing holds sway in newsrooms.
The copy sales of the newspaper should dictate the behavior or the relationship between the advertiser and the newspaper. Yeah. The strength of sales. Professor,
but in this case, it's not really the copy sales, it's how well the publisher can relate with the advertiser, can relate with the government, and he gets adverts.
On a kind of equal footing.
Yes. Yeah, before Professor comes in, and Peter is making a good point about society, because I think in this country, for very many years, the only forces that have sort of been brought to bear on journalism and the media is the state, the government, advertisers, and media owners. That missing link is always the public. How often do you see the public here exerting pressure on the media to actually change direction or change course? Very often it is either regulators, that's the government, government ministers, the president, advertisers, corporate, basically, the corporate world, and police and so on and so on and so forth. The public is the missing link. And that's why days like World Press Freedom Day, May 3rd, are very important, because it's an opportunity for us to remind the public about the place of a free press in society, about the condition of press freedom and free speech and so on and so forth.
So, Professor, just to put it in context before I come to you, in this country, combined newspaper circulation numbers are less than 150,000 copies being sold per day. And that includes the biggest circulating newspapers, the New Vision, which is hovering about 32,000, around 32,000. The Daily Monitor, which is 25 to 30,000, about 25 to 30,000 copies. And then you pick, I think Bukede, which is also about 35,000 copies. Now you pick all the others and put them together. The Observer, Sunrise, the East African, all the other newspapers and magazines put together.
The Mighty Red Paper.
The Mighty Red Paper, Kamunye, Hello, The Sun, tabloids, and broadsheets, if we have any broadsheets in this country. All of them put together. You're circulating about 150,000 newspapers. Now, if you bring Onapito's argument about new technology, social media, mobile phones and the others, TV, radio, across the border in neighboring Kenya, the Daily Nation alone is circulating 250,000 copies per day, outstripping all combined circulation in this country. And I think that, I don't know how that links the freedom of expression, the freedom of the press. How does it link with the broader questions of expression, governance, economics? How does it fit in?
Before I answer this question,
sure,
if you allow me, I would say that I'm very pleased to be here
Thank you.
on the day of the freedom of the press, and also on the 35th anniversary of the coup against the UNLF government.
Yes. You'll tell us a little more about your involvement with the UNLF government
well,
when we have the opportunity.
Yeah, well, coming to your question, it's a very concrete question. We need to make a distinction between fourth estate, the media, and the journalist. Very important distinction. Fourth estate is an institution that balances the three other estates. We need an executive which is strong, maintains security and order and law. We need a parliament, people's representative, that provides guidelines and policies. And we need a judiciary that adjudicates conflicts between the executive and the parliament and the people and so on, independent judiciary. Fourth estate is a very important institution, because without fourth estate, it will be very difficult to get the public, that's why your question is very relevant, public have knowledge about what's happening, and the fourth estate becomes the voice of the people. So fourth estate is important. The media I'm not too sure. I'm not too sure. I'm very skeptical of the media. Journalists, I have high respect for journalists. Journalists are individuals. I make a distinction between media and journalists.
Yeah.
Journalists who work in conflict situations, war situations, I've seen them on the television. They get harassed in the conflict situation by the police. If they go to war situations, they get killed. For the journalists, I have the highest respect as individuals. Media, no respect. I have no. Let me elaborate.
Yes. Where do you draw the line? How do you make the distinction?
Yeah, because I live in the West. I live in UK. The media there, in my view, is disastrous. Very bad media. They don't have good media at all. They're owned by big capitalists. They do not put forward the views of the oppressed people, the exploited people, except for very small, specialized newspapers. But the media in the United States also owned by very large corporations. And if you look at it geopolitically, the media becomes a main weapon between, at this juncture, for example, in Europe, for example, between America and Europe on the one side, and Russia and China on the other side.
Yes.
Media is owned by...
Professor, just if I may interrupt actually, just a bit. You see, and this is why this World Press Freedom Day is very important.
Yes.
The World Press Freedom Day was sort of created or established after the Windhoek Declaration. Now, one of the things the Windhoek Declaration of 1991 recognized about the media was precisely your concern about diversity of voices. The Windhoek Declaration promoted the idea that we must have not only independent media, but pluralistic media, so that you have the big capital like NTV and NMG and Monte, but you also have the other smaller media houses, some of them owned by the community, some of them owned by religious groups, some of them owned by civil society, and so on and so forth. So I don't think that the idea that we're celebrating is just commercial media. We are celebrating media in all its diversity, including media that does not actually rely on big capital, including media that's not profit-driven, and so on and so forth, including community media, so to speak. So I think that the issue, it's important, yes, to have diversity of media. I think without that diversity, you really risk undoing the democracy you're trying to do.
And Professor, you could just add some context to this. Look at the Ugandan media. The biggest owner of media in this country is the state, the government. Vision Group is the biggest media organization, or the biggest media. To use your definition of, your classification of fourth estate as separate from the media, as separate from the journalists. The other large sections of the media, the Nation Media Group runs, NTV runs the Daily Monitor, runs KFM, runs Dembe FM, and runs the East African, which is possibly the second biggest. The others are interests controlled by people who either work in government or are friends of people who work in government. Now, if you put it in that context, might be a little different from what you have in the Western world, Yes, where you have large conglomerates of media empires, Rupert Murdoch controlling a large section of the media. For a local context, how does the journalist survive in this kind of environment? How does the fourth estate survive? And how does the media cut itself out as a business interest or as...
Well, it's a much more complex question than appears on the surface. I will not no more talk about the Western world where Rupert Murdoch's own the media and so on.
Rupert Murdoch, Silvio Berlusconi in Italy.
Yeah, exactly.
Just a few.
Exactly. Berlusconi owns media and he controls the state as well. He used to be no longer there. No, it's a very complex question because when you say that in our countries in Africa, state owns the media, what does that actually mean? Who is the state? Who is the state in Africa? In Africa, we have one political independence. We have not one economic independence. 50 years down the road, we still are not independent economically. Who owns capital in Uganda? Who? Who owns capital anywhere in Africa? Who owns capital in South Africa? Not the nationalists, no.
The Guptas.
No, Gupta has come in as a corruptor, like we have here also, I guess. But no, the capital of South Africa is still owned by Anglo-American, banks, insurance companies, mining interests. They are owned by the Americans and the Europeans. Even in South Africa, they are not independent. Uganda, are we independent? Speaking as a Ugandan, I don't think we are. Seriously, we are not. So when you talk about state media, it's a complex question. It's not as simple as you might think. Because behind that state are interests that we need to analyze. And I'll come one of these days to write something about whose state are we living in.
You just launched a book yesterday.
Yeah.
Trade is War.
Yeah.
The West's War Against the World.
Yeah.
Which you launched yesterday. Maybe we'll have an opportunity to discuss that.
Right.
But also bring this, the dimension that you bring, the broadening of the question,
Right.
The interlinkages between the media, between governance and democracy, and the ownership of capital and the drivers of the economy. Just Peter, before we take the break, what is happening for the Ugandan media press in relation to the World Press Freedom Day? Just do that in 30 seconds.
ACME, African Center for Media Excellence, working with several other civil society groups that work on free expression in this country, have organized a celebration on Tuesday, the 3rd of May. We are going to start with the procession that's led by the Uganda Journalists Association in Kampala. After the procession, we shall have a panel discussion that will discuss 20 years of the press in Uganda, 20 years of the Press and Journalist Act in Uganda. We'll have a panel on freedom of information as a fundamental right, and we'll have a panel on other non-mainstream ways of expression that will be led mainly by the creatives, or, people like artists, bloggers, theater people, and so on and so forth. So we are going to be at the Golf Course Hotel in Kampala. All are welcome, and
so
we are looking forward
everybody
to
watching the fourth estate can come.
Well, yeah, we are inviting as many people as are interested in
so
this.
It's not a function for journalists, it's a function for everybody to understand the workings of it.
And let me just emphasize that point you have just made, because press freedom and freedom of expression are actually not about rights of journalists. They are about rights of citizens. They are rights of citizens.
Rights of
Free
society.
expression is not just about media, about journalists. It's about the right of a citizen to receive information and to impart information. And that right is at the heart of democracy. It's at the heart of the foundation of all other rights.
Well, talking about rights, I've been watching debate on what I honestly consider a very difficult to understand ruling by a judge of the High Court, the Supreme Court actually, Justice,
the
Constitutional Court, on the right to demonstrate, to freely assemble, and says he's given a gag order, you can't demonstrate, you can't assemble for the next 1 month in respect of the Forum for Democratic Change. I find that extremely a ridiculous ruling, in my opinion. And So we'll continue the debate about the World Press Freedom Day and the place of the media, but also to contextualize it in the broader question of governance and democracy and the associated economics and social issues. After a short commercial break, right back. The Fourth Estate with Dr. Peter Mwesige, Executive Director of the African Center for Media Excellence, Professor Yash Tandon. He's an academic activist. Yeah? Activist scholar. Yeah. Activist scholar. You've written quite a number of books. Yeah. The latest one was launched in Kampala yesterday, which is Trade is War. Yeah. And maybe we'll ask you what that means in a bit. Trade is war. The West's war against the world.
I think he wants to show it to the viewers.
Yes. I don't know if the camera can pick this a little bit more closely for people to see some of this very interesting. I haven't read the book yet, so I can't claim to know what it is. I think the guys in studio will give us the shot of the book a little. Yes, they're asking me to hold it again. Can you pick it? Yes. Trade is War. This is a book that was launched in Kampala yesterday. And like I said at the beginning of the show, Professor Yash Tandon has a very, very interesting history and relationship with the struggle for good governance and democracy in this country, running very many years ago. Let me come to the thing, and of course I just forgot to say, Ona Pito Ekomlot, Corporate Affairs Director of Narabu is SAB Mela, but Ona is part of the furniture of this show. He's part of the show. Professor, let me come back to you. Tracking back, this 35th anniversary of the coup against the UNLF government, and Uganda 35 years later. We've gone through so many transitions. We just had an election. Everybody's debating this election using their own lenses of interpretation. There have been reports of the European Union Observer Mission, reports of the Commonwealth Observer Mission, reports of local organizations like the Citizens Election Observers Network, which Peter's ACME was part of. ACME watched the media and violations related to the media and coverage of the elections themselves. You have another group that watched the money and man and politics. Different groups. Right. If you could just benefit from your own experience, trying to forge a functional governance system in this country and where we are today, what would you say we are?
Well, I've been away for quite some time, so I can't be too concrete about what's happening in Uganda. I've been away. But I would agree with you and emphasize what you say, that unless we have a system of governance that is accountable to the people, one that is able to, yes, bring law and order, but within a system of justice that is underpinned by principles of equity and fairness, unless we have that kind of system with an independent judiciary and also a strong fourth estate, I maintain that concept, we will always run into crises after crises. This is not only the case in Uganda. I see that the case with a lot of African countries, but more significantly in the Middle East, and I must say even the West. In the Middle East, if you look at Turkey, for example, I again find that the media is doing, journalists in Turkey are doing a great job, but the media is also owned by the state and other interests, and they are in prison. If I look at Western countries, the governance in Western countries, I live in United Kingdom and I know United States quite well from before. I find that there is a lack of democratic system in the West. There is no real democracy in the West at all. No, totally not. If you look at the elections in the United States going on right now, they are the people of the establishment who are trying to get elected, and both Trump and
Hillary or Ted Cruz?
No,
Wait.
No,
both
Bernie
Trump and-
Sanders.
and
Bernie
No,
Sanders.
you have Ted Cruz and
they
Kasich
are
on the other side.
outside of the establishment.
Yes, that's Trump and Trump and Sanders.
Sanders are outside of the establishment. And as you can see, Sanders is having a rough time. He got a lot of support from the people. The youth are supporting him. But where does he go? There are the people in the establishment, the special votes, that are not going to allow him to be president.
The super delegates.
Super delegates, delegates, super delegates.
Yes.
So you see, the American system, they call it democratic, is totally in the hands of corporate capital and the establishment. Totally undemocratic.
Who's the best representative of corporate capital than Donald Trump?
Donald
you put it
Trump
that way.
is not part of the establishment. That's the point. He's very rich, but anti-establishment. So he, at least from the anti-establishment, is on the forefront.
But I
And
mean-
now these people is establishment so
No,
worried.
look,
They are trying to find out whether the Trump can be trumped with another candidate.
Yes.
to me, I think, Professor, the difference between Africa and those, the Western world is precisely the fact that the establishment, the rich, are not using force to keep themselves in power. They may be using bribery, they may be using manipulation. The problem in Africa is the element of force, and you lived through that experience, whereby UNLF was an attempt to use manipulation and argument, but then someone had to bring in force as a third factor, and that's what really changes the whole picture. I have no problem with having an establishment, having corporate interests prevail, so long as there is no use of force. If people are swayed by persuasion, they are swayed by bribery, somehow I think that's why there is some element of progress in the Western world. In terms of material satisfaction, they don't have internal refugees. If we could reach that level in Africa, whereby you don't have to use force and use other means, I would be comfortable.
Just to add some little bit of context there, go back to the Moshi conference. An attempt by academics, activists, politicians who saw politics as politics that can be resolved on a round table. You go into Moshi, have your discussions, but they really don't matter because you can't resolve the fundamental that you needed the men who were on the front line. And that brings back the Obote factor, how Paulo Mwanga, because he was on the front line. Yoweri Museveni, who's the president of Uganda today, he's just won his 5th term as an elected president, heading to a phenomenal 35 years in power. He'll be sworn in 11 days from now. He'll be sworn in 11 days from now to start his 4th term. But President Museveni comes into the Moshi conference primarily because he was a man on the front line. It does not put a significant... actually, we're having problems now because we're trying to read a Western template towards democratization instead of following the template that had been set by factors like what you saw in 35 years ago.
Well, that history is very complicated. One of these days I'm going to write about that, Moshi conference and all that. And I'll come to your question about violence in a minute.
Yes.
But since you are now addressing the question of Museveni, President Museveni in power so long, let me make my personal position clear on this one. Myself, I'm not against a good government staying in power for a long time. I'm not against that. Castro has been in power a long time. The question is, how do you use your power when you are in power? And Castro has used it, in my view, for the people. And the Americans tried to dislodge him. He refused. The people supported him. Okay? So the question is not regime change. This question of regime change is an imperial construct. It's the construct of the empire. They want regime change in Syria. They want regime change in Libya, in Iraq. The mess they have made of so-called regime change. No, I'm totally against the imperial construct of the concept of regime change. We want change in government, yes. Democratically, yes. We should have periodic change in government, as the people want, sure. And I like the tradition set by Nyerere in Tanzania. After 2 terms, you go. That's fine. But I am not against a good people-backed government that can stay 30 years, 40 years in power, provided he uses his power, he or she uses the power to mobilize the people to fight against the number one enemy we have still, empire. Now that was the problem about Moshi Conference. Before the Moshi Conference, we had debate in Dar es Salaam for 8 years. Nabudere, Monijo, Kansa, all these, Mamdani, Shivji. It's called the Dar es Salaam debate. And the one question on which we disagreed with Mamdani and Shivji on the question of who is the enemy in our countries. And they were arguing that Amin is the enemy and the local commercial bourgeoisie who were supporting Amin are the enemy. We said no, agent. Amin still was an agent of the British, even when he was in power. So while we must fight to get Amin out of power, our enemy still remains the empire. And still today, that's the empire,
Yes.
enemy.
And how have
So it's a very complicated question.
these attempts at democratization, these attempts at breaking links with empire. In Uganda, we have seen it on the debate on homosexuality. We've seen it with the president saying the other day after being re-elected, and very harsh reports of the observers, especially from the West, dismissing, don't tell me how to run my country. But the construct remains the same. And personally, I
would
think
say
before,
that,
maybe before Professor answers Charles' argument, I really struggle with this idea of the empire is the enemy. First of all, I believe Uganda is a creature of the empire. And it could only survive as a state, a functional state, if it went along the designs of the empire. This was not Buganda kingdom. This was diverse ethnic groups. The empire created it into a single entity, set up its mode of administration, and to try and run away from the empire and imagine that it can work. I think that's precisely why Africa is not working. Unless if you return Africa to the original pre-colonial setups, where there were chiefs and kings ruling their small domains, but to try and bring all these groups and impose a supposedly an independent system, which was not there in the first place. So what exactly is the system that can run independent Africa if it's not the empire system?
maybe Peter has
Because it was created by the empire.
Wow, really? I find that position totally unacceptable.
For me, I'll bring
I can't accept that.
Simplify the argument by going back to the fundamentals. The press freedom, freedom of expression being at the heart of all these rights that we're talking about. Because no society, whether it's American, whether it is Ugandan, African, whatever, can survive, thrive, claim to be a civilization without freedom of expression. You cannot purport to hold your leaders accountable or to be a voice of the people without freedom of expression. And I think, Professor, I thought we would agree on certain fundamentals, regardless of whether Castro was a good leader or not, that we can agree on the principle of regular, free and fair elections. We can agree on the principle of rule of law. We can agree on the principle of participation and principle of respect for human rights and all those that so it doesn't really, we don't have to have the exact same system as those in the West, but those are values or principles that we all agree on. We cannot claim to be a democracy or to be representing the people if we do not have those kinds of principles. In Uganda's context, for instance, you can judge Museveni along these lines. Is his power accountable? Do the citizens of Uganda hold him to account? Do they have all the information they need in order to make a true judgment about his exercise of power or not? Are the media playing that role? Was the last election free and fair? How would you know if you don't even know whether the results-based claims he has are actually real? What delayed the
delivery of
materials in Kampala, Wakaso, and Jinja? Does anybody actually know what exactly happened at the East warehouses? Those, for me, are real practical questions that are at the heart of what we claim to be democracy or developing democracy in this country.
And just for you to be able to respond to these different arguments, even at the Moshi conference, was it those fundamentals that determined the discussion and what happened later? or the interests of a few people using these formations of, yes, copied from the Western democracy to try and get power for themselves and hold it and not want to let it go. You could even extend it and say, yes, Tanzania has gone through an election, it has a different outset, but Tanzania has modeled itself in a different kind of way, and it seems to be delivering for the Tanzanian people. The Kenyans have spent the last 5 years of this new regime fighting against the International Criminal Court, which was largely created by African countries. You see the mess that is happening in Burundi because Pierre Nkurunziza decided to remove term limits and insisted that he had more opportunity. It's happening. Rwanda is holding together, yes, but there's been a shift of goalposts. You can't really say that the Western concept of democracy is the problem here. There is also a problem that seems to be very domestic.
Well, I cannot disagree with you. I cannot disagree with many of the things that you say. The problem with our discussion, not the problem, the discussion here, we are moving at different levels of abstraction. There are 3 or 4 levels of abstraction. You are much more concrete, and I'm at a slightly another level of abstraction. How can I possibly disagree with the values you talk about? Fundamental freedoms, values of the people for decent employment, and so on. These are very important. These are values. Then there's material reality. There's always a conflict between values and material reality. We Marxists call it between ideas and matter, mind and matter, the dialectic relationship. Matter rules, okay, because matter is significant. We are still neo-colonial. Our economy is not owned by us. But mind can change matter. Nyerere tried to with his Ujamaa policies. But the hold of corporate capital in Tanzania was so powerful that he admitted when he left that he realized he didn't have the power to change. So, friends, let's be very clear about our diagnosis. I found that in Uganda, the media is very poor, what I read, very poor, because they have description, wrong things are going wrong. Then they have prescription, do this. I go to a doctor, I say, I have a problem, I describe my problem. The doctor then analyzes, diagnoses, and then he prescribes medicines, prescription. Here, description, prescription. Hey, where's the diagnosis?
Who is supposed to do the diagnosis?
Exactly.
Yes.
Who? We. And therefore this
Who is we? Is it you as the
no,
academia?
4 of us.
Yes.
4 of us here. 4 of us here. And I would say the general body of activist intellectuals. For me, not academia. Academia is an obstruction. Academia, in my view, is a problem because they deal in abstractions. We need to have intellectuals, and we have, my God, Uganda has intellectuals. I mean, yesterday I met with several people who were intellectually very powerful. We need to have a debate that will put in a diagnosis. Why? And my simple diagnosis is the following. In 1776, let me give an analogy. In 1776, the Americans told the English, we now have independence. We don't want to grow cotton and tobacco for you anymore. We want to manufacture ourselves. We have now political independence, we want economic independence. 1776. Within 50 years, okay, they stopped supporting cotton, and this is material reality, cotton and tobacco. Within 50 years, America got manufacturing industry. 50 years. What is our reality in Uganda? Material reality. After 50 years, we have lost everything. When I was a child, we used to have 6, 7 industries manufacturing clothes. I used to wear clothes manufacturing here. We don't have them anymore. Why? Because we have been under a system called free trade. That's what my book about. Free trade is a total fiction.
What happened to the fundamental change, the 10-point program?
3-point program?
Sir, 10-point program.
Well, 10-point program is at the ideological level. Okay?
And 30 years?
Purely ideological level. Then at the material reality, that has not transformed material reality. Castro was able to. Castro put forward his 10-point program. Within 20 years, he changed the material reality. The Americans were out. Castro was right.
You could say Lee Kuan Yew
And
as well.
Venezuela is right. Chavez did in just 15 years. You know, Chavez was elected 15 times by the people. Only once he lost election. 15 times people elected him. Now he's gone. I don't know how he died. But the successor is trying to bring about Chavez program called Chavinism. And the people are supporting him. You know who is against him? The Americans. And the big corporations. That's the point.
For how long do you place Africa's problem on the doorsteps of the imperialists, of the colonialists, of the corporates?
No, I'm
see,
not
for
talking.
me,
Forget about imperialists. No,
that's your
reality is
Prof.
no, forget about no. You have to understand the empire. It's not forgetting blame on them. I'm not. You see, blame. There are two responsibility has two meanings. One is accusative. You accuse. I accuse empire. I accuse President Museveni. Accusative.
I accuse Besigye,
Then
I accuse...
Accuse. Second meaning of responsibility is inquisitive. You inquire. Diagnostics is inquisitive. I don't blame the empire. They are their reality. I diagnose, and I diagnose. Not accusatively. I'm not blaming. Reality. What do we own in Africa? Come on, what do we own in Uganda?
Can we pick that up?
Nothing.
After? Can we pick that up after
Yeah,
a short
pick that up.
commercial break? We'll be right back.
Okay.
You're still watching The Fourth Estate, and we just made one quick change to let Rosebel Kagumiri, very many people know her. She's one of the most prolific bloggers and social media activists this country has. So Rosebel Kagumiri has joined us, and Peter has had to exit. We'll conclude the discussion. When we're wrapping up, we'll do a little bit about the themes of the World Press Freedom Day. But
and because I believe in giving way to ladies, I left my seat comfortably and moved to...
you took you're very strategic. You decided to shift strategically and take a new position. Rosebel, very nice to have you on set, even when we're going to have you for only about 15 to 20 minutes. We're having a very intense discussion to ask the questions of governance and democracy, the question of freedoms, press freedoms, and with Professor. Where is the problem? Where, in your view, where does the problem seem to fall? We go through periodic elections because it is the nice thing to do. Invite observers, go through motions. Professor, there's been a huge debate in this country. Did we have to spend the colossal sums of money that we spent on an election? And you put it right. What kind of election? I mean, I think it was Peter who was saying that. Once you have done the election, fundamentally, what does it mean? How does it fit into the discussion of freedoms of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the whole broader governance question?
Thank you, Charles. I think it's important to know that we are simply transplanting systems in the country. And it will take a while when you're transplanting something to really work for you. And you must understand that you're transplanting that system. I think we seem to be struggling. We have to fit in a wider international system that has come to accept that elections are the sign of democracy. And somehow, if you don't have an election, you're indicted. And that's where we're operating from. That said, it doesn't mean that the election itself cannot really reflect the ideals or the will of the people. It's how it is carried out. And I think how an election is carried out depends on so many things. And that said, I think we still have a problem that we do not understand a state system. We've been independent for only a few decades, and people don't understand.
50 years is a long time. It's not a short time.
It's really a short time in state formation, to be honest. It's really short time. And I think people in my village don't understand how their life relates to the state. They don't know that every day if they buy paraffin, they are supporting a state system, they're paying a tax. It doesn't occur to them. There are few people who understand that. So we are still far away. And those things, those gaps still affect how our democracy will evolve.
Professor, if I could just come back to you on that. What creates that kind of thing? That people participate in the process, they go in an election, they are citizens, they elect leaders, or they have leaders, and can't establish the necessary links. What explains that?
Well, yeah, I'll come back to Rosemary. Huh?
Rosebell.
Rosemary, huh?
Rosebell.
Rosebell.
Yes.
Rosebell has drawn the distinction that I was making.
Mm.
She talks about people in the villages, okay,
Mm-hmm.
living a life of their own. They don't necessarily connect with the state. This is the point I'm making.
Mm.
The point is, there's an ideology.
Mm.
Elections, democracy is an ideology. There's a material reality.
Mm.
If you don't understand the relationship between the material reality and ideology, okay, very difficult to analyze what's happening. And you know, Rosebell, I agree with you. It's just very still time. But we got to be able to change the material reality of the people so that they are able to live a life of security, well-being, and able to get their children educated and all that, well-being, in order for them then to be able to participate in an electoral system. Elections are important, but for them to be effectively able to participate in election system, they have to change material reality first. Not first, simultaneously. The two are dialectical. And that process in all of Africa, has not gone. Even in South Africa, it has not succeeded. That's why there is, in South Africa, let's not always go and talk about Uganda. Uganda is a small country. Look at South Africa, much bigger. The people are where they were 15 years ago. There's no land for the people. The land is owned still by whites and corporations. Court cases have come up, which has transferred all this. No change in land, okay? And the workers are worse off. The workers, in fact, are shot dead in the mines, as you know. So that system, South Africa is still a neo-colony. It's not owned by the people, it's owned by the empire. Therefore, unless you adjust this relationship between materiality, okay, you can't. So, Rosebell, I fully agree with you.
So for me, yes, I agree with the professor's analysis. So the challenge now is who will change the material reality of the people. Currently, the assumption is that a government which is not really having the pressure from the people will do it. And that's for me, I don't think it will do it.
Are you thinking benevolence?
Yeah, that's the benevolence, which unfortunately that's why then for me, I believe that the private sector, which in Professor's analysis is part of the imperial world,
not all of it. Not all private
is
sector.
largely best placed to do that.
Not all private sector. In fact, we
Because
have
the
national,
private sector.
We have national private sector. I didn't use the word private sector. Please don't put words into my mouth. I never said private sector.
Yes.
Okay.
I said there is a corporate capital, global, but there is a national private sector.
Fine, whether it is national or global, in my view,
okay,
it
that's
can all
important
then be
distinction.
corporate capital, which can which can cause that transformation, which will create the necessary awareness of the people to demand for proper electoral system. But to expect the same government, which is not having enough pressure from the people, to change their conditions such that they're able to appreciate democracy the way we know it, I think it's not going to happen.
Let me put a question to Professor. Professor, Africa has been independent for 50 years. It remains a neo-colonial continent. We remain under the funds of neo-colonialism. What in your study, what in your you called it inquisitive discovery, asking questions and trying to understand the reality.
Sure.
What is it that has stood in the way of that realization that when we started the struggle for independence, it was not just a struggle for independence, it was a struggle to change in a fundamental way?
Well, good question. And by the way, I agree with your the point that going. Well, I think what has happened is that the first generation, partly it's a leadership question. The first generation of leaders that we had, okay, Nyerere, Nkrumah, Lumumba, Obote, Kaunda, okay, these who brought political independence for us, tried to bring about changes also, and systematically, the empire, I have to go on insisting the empire, whether you like it or not, empire got rid of them. Lumumba was actually assassinated on the order of President in
the American president.
United States, US president at the time. Nkrumah was manipulated out by market forces. Tobacco forces, fell down, moved. Nyerere survived because he had the back of the people, therefore your point is valid. Obote brought a Commonwealth Charter. He was resented by the British because he took over some of the commanding heights of the British assets here, as you know, and also some of the Indian assets probably. He went to the conference, and what did the British do? They incited the Israelis to back army to stage a coup. Amin was put in power by this guy, by the British. You see, my friends, I think I've gone through this 50 years of struggle in Uganda. I was part of that struggle. I can talk with some experience. I'm not claiming that I know all. No. So we in Moshi were trying to formulate a leadership. And I think Moshi was successfully brought all parties together, 35 groups, including some people criticized for us. We brought Kabaki Eka too. Some people say, this is a feudal one. We said, no, feudal enemy, okay, but they're not our enemy. The king Kabaki is not our enemy. Feudal system, we can work with him. You remember? But you know, what we discovered the following. I'm saying leadership question. You mentioned Gang of Four. I was one of them. And we went through a difficult time. That 1 year was a period of chaos, despair, frustration, killings, all that. And yet there was some optimism. And then we decided, I won't go too long, this is too much of a personal experience. We decided, whilst the objective conditions for revolution in Uganda is ripe, objective conditions is for Africa is ripe. Namely, the reality of the people on the ground is so poor, they need revolution, social revolution. The subjective conditions are not there. People's consciousness is not there. So UNLF had a guerrilla force. Yes, we operated from Kitale. But we found the Gang of Four, the others, our leadership was very big actually. We found that we leadership was marching ahead of the people. And the masses were not with us. So we disbanded. We are the only Maoist group. We were a Maoist group, let me declare that openly today in Uganda. We were the only Maoist party in the whole world that voluntarily dismantled our army. We dismantled it because we were behind. Then we said, we had a policy called grassrooting. We must go to grassroots. Nabudere went to Mbale, Rugumai went to Toro, Omonyo went to Karamoja. I had no tribe. So
you stayed in Kampala.
No. This is a question so personal to me.
Yes.
And personal to all of us, by the way.
Let me just take you back.
So I'm glad you joined us because I'm at level with you. This is this dialectical relationship between matter and consciousness.
No, but just hold on. I want to ask you a question. You say you are Maoists. China is now seen to have achieved the material conditions largely of the people. But it seems like the leadership has not really had to adjust to the demands of the people, but has just done it top down.
I want to discuss China. This is very complex.
Okay, no. I just wanted to take you back on that day personal history. You gave a lecture in Tanzania on the Common Man's Charter. And there was someone in the audience who disagreed with you. Would you like to share a little bit of that experience?
No, I think I look at it with some degree of nostalgia. Yes, I lectured on the Common Man's Charter. I think it must be 1968 to 1990. No, Common Man's Charter was 69, so about 70 or so. And it was actually our President Museveni who had formed a radical group among the students, which was challenging us, which was challenging the professors. That's a good thing about them, that they were not accepting the position taken by the students' union created by ZANU, by the party.
TANU, Tanzania African National Union.
Yeah, so they were not accepting that position. They formed their own radical group. and their purpose to challenge professors, challenge even for example. That's the context. Now, in that context, Martin Yashtanden, who was supposed to have been party to writing of the Common Charter. So he talks, and this young man, who now is our president, challenges him. And of course, I look at it with some amusement because I like that, people to challenge. I defended our attempt to move to the left. But I was aware, even at that time, that's not going to be easy. It will be challenging.
What was his view then? What was his view? What was it?
Well,
his
no,
disagreement?
we didn't have a chance to discuss. It was simply from the floor he questioned me, and we didn't have a chance to discuss. That goes back to a long time ago.
Rosebel, let me just bring you back into this discussion. We started this discussion on the World Press Freedom Day, which will be on Tuesday. Today is World Labour Day, and there were celebrations earlier today in Western Uganda. When you look at the conditions of the workers, the reason we have World Labour Day, the media and the environment in which it operates, the reason we have World Press Freedom Day, we have just gone through an election. We'll have a swearing in 11 days from now. And you have a court decision by Justice Kavuma the other day saying, put a ban on demonstrations, processions, and everything for a period of 1 month. I don't know what will happen after 1 month if that automatically gets lifted. And you're trying to contextualize this and say the gap that Professor is talking about between the ideal and the reality on the ground. And where you find that meeting point, that the people understand the dynamics, they live in the reality that they live in, but they also understand where the ideal is supposed to be, to meet, to have a meeting point that moves the country on. Because Professor said 1776, the Americans declare their own independence. They use a period of 50 years to break links, but also to build a nation called the United States of America. That's based on manufacturing, that has capitalism and everything. You have Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, who uses a period of 30 years to transform a country from a third world into a first world economy. And he referred to Cuba, Fidel Castro, who says, I'm starting a revolution and see through that revolution in spite of all the embargo, in spite of everything, and builds a country but finds a convenient point to say, I am transitioning, handing over to Raul. Raul has indicated he is transitioning in 2018, handing over to someone else. And you see the people are behind. But for the majority of the African continent, actually all the African continent, you can't find that opportunity. Gaddafi holds power for 42 years. He doesn't have, Professor, forgive me for saying this, but he doesn't have the foresight to say, what happens when I'm not there? And the country falls apart. Hosni Mubarak, 30 years, doesn't have the thinking and saying, if I'm not there, what holds this society together? And how does Uganda fit into that kind of context?
That's a good question, Charles. The issue is that the examples you've given, of course, Cuba put up a real resistance. I've been to Cuba and it's a lovely country. But they paid a heavy price. So as a country, you have to ask yourself, what's the price you're going to pay in this fight? Because you're fighting people bigger than you. If you're fighting international forces, people are forcing a system to you and you don't want it, it's about how much are you willing to pay. And that, transplant that in the Ugandan context. Ugandans are facing the reality right now is that we don't have freedom of assembly. You know, people cannot easily, meet.
Public Order Management Act.
Yes, we can't. We can't assemble. We can, and freedom of assembly. You might think it's about basically, but if you curtail people, they can't meet. They cannot deliberate. You are in fact kind of putting them in a box that they will not think too much. They cannot easily share their thoughts. If people cannot meet and discuss, they cannot share their thoughts, they cannot advance certain positions in their society. So the freedom to assemble is a very critical thing for the country. And if we can't have that, if a whole judge is saying we cannot have freedom to assemble, then we are in a sorry state. And the citizens, we need to think about how then are we best suited to find ways to assemble. You've brought about Egypt. Back in 2008, I met bloggers and online activists from Egypt before the revolution, before we even knew what was going on. young people were meeting online, became their virtual meeting.
Exactly.
When Mubarak closed all spaces where Egyptians could not meet, people met in mosques, met at churches. You know, the revolution was underground. The world did not know what was going on in Egypt, but young people were online in platforms discussing issues. So when we saw people coming to Tahrir Square, they didn't just wake up. And Ugandans must know we will not just wake up and do something. We have to find alternative means. If the regime says you can't do this, I don't agree with the whole idea that to a certain extent you would gain by saying, I will clash with the regime. Sometimes that's a lot of price to pay. You'll lose lives. So it's about how do you think better than the regime tactically? You know, in terms of tactics, in terms of strategies, like we have seen in Egypt. We saw people are still rising up. Even then, you have seen that the resistance is still there against Sisi. You know, he's not having a good time. Even if he came back, people are still, the revolution anniversary was the other time, and people are still pushing because the revolution in Egypt was indigenous. It was a movement. They only got a spark. They did not, no one in America gave them anything. Like when you read online, you see Ugandans thinking, oh, Americans should, you know, come and help us take a regime, which is really, really, you know, that's not really believing in yourself, because you have to work. We have to believe in working for ourselves. That's why even if you think Egypt is a lost cause, people tend to put it off. I think it's a stage. But the reality is that it was an indigenous movement. There was no one from outside that brought people in Egypt to face their leader. Honor. It was Egyptians.
We're moving towards swearing in parliament, a new parliament. We have a new government coming into effect. And the discussion from where Rosbel has brought it. What is that? Because as a corporate person, you cannot advance this. You can't sell beer. You can't sell water to people who are in a state of extreme. One, they're very poor, as she said, and they don't create the necessary links. You can send a few people to sleep for some time, but they need to be able to be part of the discussion, be part of the direction setting. And Uganda has been at that for the last 50 years. The Ashton Dons were doing that.
They are debating that question in Moshi. The question has been debated, and from Rosbel's position, yes, I think the argument is still that there can't be a revolution. I have no problem with that, but a revolution to do what? And that's the crisis. Even if you had a revolution in Uganda, the people who lead that revolution will want to take state power. And if they go ahead to do the same things as it happened, 1986 happened, that when Amin was removed, nothing will change. Because I fundamentally believe that the people whom you say cannot afford beer will not be able to afford beer because the state will have done something dramatic, because I know it won't do anything. I still believe the corporate world must be given more leeway to be able to create market, because the majority of the people who cannot afford beer in Uganda are farmers. They must have real markets. They must be able to produce and sell.
But I
and just hold on. They can only produce and sell if there is somebody who is going to process their farm produce into a finished good. And that person must be sure that they have a market, first and foremost within Uganda, to sell that finished good. Backward and forward linkages can only be created by a private corporate entity, not by government.
In what kind of political...
disagree, Charles.
Well, it's fine to disagree, but this has gone on for 50 years.
Right now, when you talk about corporate, who is the corporate? Exactly. There are so many questions to be answered. Who has economic rights? Who has access to capital? Do not just, put something in a shell called a corporate. Who is corporate in this country? Who has the power? And those questions are very key when we are going to talk. If it's going to be a corporate world that can support people to advance, it has to be a corporate world that is representative. It cannot be those markets you're talking about, the kind of reality. People in my village, if you have no access to land, by the way, if you have no, these are critical rights.
It's fine.
So you can talk about corporate, but we have to talk about rights. And revolutions are about rights and access. Who is able to get in that corporate and who is unable to get in? And why are they unable to get in?
See,
and that's where the conversation
things like land are being over-glorified.
Sure.
Just hold on. A lot of people are leaving Africa to go to the Western world. They don't go to own any land. They only go to look for a job and earn income.
No,
So first and foremost, just hold on.
Just a moment.
Africans
Can I put this
must
into
be
context?
able to earn the means
I hear you.
to meet their
How
needs.
do the corporate interests, how does the political leadership, how does the general public, the majority of the people, align to achieve that broad fundamental that everybody desires? Because you need an environment in which to operate.
When I talk
The
of
pe-
corporates,
yes.
the understanding often is that these are international companies, these controlled by foreigners. That's not my thinking.
No, no.
I'm only saying you need profit to be the main driver of delivery of public goods.
You need
Okay.
Profit.
Profit.
Because
Profit has
what is about it?
because it drives the actors.
Okay.
Profit drives the actors.
You need an
We are very
economic
good at
system.
discussion.
Never.
I'm afraid the show is about to come to an end. But Professor, one, I would like you to give us what your take is on his argument in your book, if you try to answer that question. But the other question is, when does leadership provide leadership that carries the people along?
Well, I think the leadership is the key issue, no question about that, yes. And I think the leadership isolates itself if it is not able to bring the people with them. Okay? If the leadership gets into a situation where it can deal with global structures, with World Trade Organizations, IMF, all these people, and accept their policies, IMF policies of structural adjustment program, then very quickly those policies, okay, will create impoverishment, and the leadership gets alienated from the people. Look at the example of Greece. Okay, Greece is a European country, became indebted to the banks, and the German banks, the IMF and the European bank began to give credit to Greece on conditionalities, which are structural adjustment conditionalities. Today, a European country no longer has control over resources or markets. The German banks are simply taking over the assets because they have to clear the debts. Now, what is happening to Greece in the last just 5 years has been happening to Africa for 35 to 50 years. So, coming to leadership, back to your question. If the leadership takes its policies from the IMF, and what's happened to Greece now is happening to us for 35, 40 years, you can see the total alienation with the leadership and the people. Come on.
That's
Can
That's happening.
Can it turn to China, to Russia, to Iran, resolve that question? If you're not borrowing from IMF, you're borrowing from
I think you
Exim
have
Bank.
to look within. You know, like was it Kwame Nkrumah who said, "I neither look left, west, or east. I look to myself."
Exactly.
We have to look at home and be able to evolve our own systems that relate. We are not going to find okay, maybe only unique system. We can borrow from whatever works for us. Let us define what works for us. Whether it's a bit of China or a bit of Russia, or a bit of our own indigenous
yes,
systems.
Are we capable of doing that?
We just need to.
When do we move away from sloganeering?
Absolutely.
you know, you can use the West as an auger, threaten children, threaten your citizens to say this is where the thing you refused, Professor. No. The thing Professor was talking about, don't point fingers, don't blame, the blame game. But the leadership can use that. This opposition is funded by the West. This civil society, especially what has been happening in this country, this civil society, these are advancing Western interests. You don't get to analyze and answer the question. In the absence of organized discussion, dialogue, debates that you had during your time, led by scholars, academics, civil society, intellectuals, when that space is not there, there is a lot of talk. There is a lot of talk in this country, but that talk doesn't translate into something real that can cause that fundamental change, if I want to borrow that word. How long? What's your projection for the future of Africa? Maybe that will be my last question. Given your projection for the future of Africa, given the reality that we are in today.
Well, first of all, let me say that I agree with Rosebell completely. I think that's very important. I think there is no development until it is self-development. Even for a person. A person cannot depend on somebody outsider to develop himself or herself.
Yeah.
Self-development. If he is or she is indisciplined, then she must discipline herself so that she develops. Quintessence principle. I agree with that. Therefore, we have to develop ourselves, all right? Now, what was your question?
My question is, looking at Africa where it is today.
Where is it today? Well,
Yes.
well,
What does the future look like?
I see that, by the way, do you know a publication called Pambazuka Press?
Yeah.
Okay. Pambazuka Press is a Pan-African periodical outlet, comes out fortnightly, I think, which has, you look at that, you have various people writing from all over Africa, okay? And it's amazing, they are, of course, there are debate between them, but it's amazing how they are articulating a discourse which is generally on the common platform, both condemning our dictatorial regimes in Africa, while at the same time looking at the material reality which is owned by the empire. That discourse is there. And therefore, we do in Africa have a lot of intellectual power. Okay, that power has not translated, the intellectual power has not translated into governing power yet. I'm optimistic. I used to be very pessimistic for the last 30, 40 years. Now I am optimistic. Why? I tell you why. The empire is collapsing. I live in UK. I can predict that in 10 years' time, Europe will dismantle. UK will dismantle. Scotland will have its own regime. Ireland is separate. UK will dismantle. America will survive as a powerful country, but Europe goes. Empires in crisis, financial crisis, environmental crisis, people's crisis. You know, when students march in London, the police comes and breaks their necks. In Paris, they do the same. Don't talk about Uganda alone. In the empire, they're cracking heads of people. In Turkey, which is supported by the empire, they kill people. This is the world we live in. In this world, what is happening is the total shift of balance of power. Empire is collapsing, and the Americans know that. China, Russia, Brazil, Iran, they are picking up. So the question you were raising, we don't emulate the examples, no, but there is a space created where we can utilize the balance shift, utilize that for us to create space for ourselves, and that is happening. And I'm optimistic we will get there. Africa will get there.
So you believe in Africa is rising?
I believe, not the way they are talking about. IMF puts forward, Africa has 5% growth rate, 6, 7%. This Africa, complete fiction. Because 5, 6 growth rate they're talking about is creating impoverishment.
Okay, I'm afraid this discussion, as interesting as it is, must come to an end. We must let people go to sleep and prepare for work tomorrow. Thank you very much, Rosemary Kagumire, for joining us. Wish we had you for much longer than we actually had you, but we'll invite you to come back next time. Professor, very nice to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be here, and it's an engaging conversation, even if you disagree. That's okay.
On this anniversary. And, thank you very much, let me just end this where we began it from. A very interesting day to have this edition of the Fourth Estate. It is Labor Day, the 1st of May. World Press Freedom Day will be on Tuesday, and the Ugandan celebration. Wuja is organizing a procession for journalists, and then there will be a dialogue and a debate at the Golf Course Hotel, organized by the African Center for Media Excellence, ACME. This is also the day when we lost Nobo Mayombo. That's 9 years ago, 2007, 9 years ago. And this is also the day when the UNLF government, the coup against UNLF government
35 years ago.
35 years ago. And who were the coup leaders?
We'll not get into that.
The military commission of Pablo Moy and Museveni were the coup leaders 35 years ago. And we'll be keeping you updated on this station and on the Fourth Estate as we move towards the swearing in and what that means, and with the court rulings and the threat of establishing an alternative government by by the FDC, which claims it won the election but was cheated of victory. Professor, you have a last word?
Well, no, I don't want to have. No, I don't want last word. No, last word is yours. Except that you can ask people to look at this book.
To look at this book, I'm going to be the first to try and read it because I haven't read it yet.
Okay.
Trade is War: The West's War Against the World by Yash Tandon. And Yash Tandon, I'm sure that Professor Edward Rugumayo must be struggling to keep up to watch this show up to the end. Made the Gang of Four. Been very nice to have a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much to all our viewers for joining us tonight and always, and thank you very much to our wonderful production team that stays up late to make sure this show comes to you. Have a good night.